The donkey stood 3 feet from the water trough, ears pinned back, refusing to drink. Ezekiel Marsh had never seen anything like it in 20 years of ranching. The animal would approach, sniff the air, then back away as if the water itself carried some invisible threat. Ezekiel crouched beside the wooden trough, running his weathered fingers along its edges. The water looked clear, smelled clean, same as it had every morning for the past decade. He'd built this trough himself, positioned it near the old oak where the spring water ran coldest. Every animal on his property drank from it without hesitation. Every animal except his most reliable donkey. "Come on, Dusty," he whispered, holding out his hand. The donkey approached slowly, nuzzled his palm, then jerked its head toward the trough and brayed once. Sharp, urgent, like a warning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Ezekiel studied his stubborn animal. Dusty had been with him since the day he'd bought this land from the previous owner. Never sick, never difficult, never refusing food or water. The donkey was more reliable than most people he'd known. But 3 days now, same behavior. Dusty would drink from the stream down the hill, would drink from buckets Ezekiel filled by hand. But approach this trough? Not a chance. Ezekiel stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. Something was wrong here, and it wasn't the water. Animals had instincts that ran deeper than human understanding. He'd learned to trust those instincts during his years working cattle drives across the territory. When horses spooked at empty trails, smart men listened. When dogs refused to enter certain buildings, wise folk found other shelter. He walked around the trough, examining every angle. The wood showed normal wear, no cracks or rot. The metal bands held tight. Nothing unusual about the construction or appearance. Yet Dusty maintained his distance, watching with dark eyes that seemed to hold knowledge Ezekiel couldn't grasp. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Clementine Ross rode up on her spotted mare, her silver hair braided down her back despite the early hour. She'd lived in these parts longer than anyone, knew every story and secret these hills contained. "Morning, Ezekiel," she called, dismounting with the grace of someone half her age. "Heard you've been having some trouble with your animals." Ezekiel nodded toward Dusty, who remained frozen in his suspicious stance. 3 days now. Won't touch the water. Clementine approached the trough, and her expression changed immediately. Her face went pale, and she took 2 quick steps backward. "You need to move that donkey away from here," she said quietly. "Right now." "Why? What's wrong?" She looked at him with eyes that held decades of buried knowledge. "Because some things are better left undisturbed. Ezekiel, and that trough, it's sitting on ground that holds more than water." Ezekiel stared at Clementine, searching her weathered face for answers. "What do you mean holds more than water?" She glanced around nervously, as if the hills themselves might be listening. "This land, it wasn't always yours. Ezekiel, before you bought it from Henderson there was another owner, man named Tobias Ward." The name meant nothing to Ezekiel, but the way Clementine spoke it carried weight. She moved closer, lowering her voice despite the empty landscape around them. "Ward was a hard man, kept to himself mostly, but folks in town knew things about him, things that made them cross the street when he rode by." She paused, watching Dusty, who remained motionless near the trough. "He disappeared one winter, just up and vanished. When spring came, Henderson bought the property at auction." Ezekiel felt a chill despite the warming sun. "Disappeared how?" "Nobody knows for certain, but there were stories about Ward, about money he'd taken from people, debts he'd collected through methods that weren't exactly legal." Clementine's eyes fixed on the ground beneath the trough. "Some said he buried things, valuable things. Others said he buried things that were better left buried." The donkey snorted and pawed the ground, drawing both their attention. Dusty's behavior had grown more agitated since Clementine arrived, as if her presence confirmed his suspicions about the area. "You think something's buried under there?" Ezekiel asked. Before Clementine could answer, the sound of an approaching rider echoed across the valley. A man on a black horse rode toward them with purpose, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. As he drew closer, Ezekiel recognized the stern features of Boone Carter, a newcomer to the region who'd been asking questions around town about old properties and their histories. Boone dismounted without invitation, his cold eyes immediately focusing on the trough. "Morning, folks. Heard there might be some interesting discoveries happening out here." Clementine stepped backward, her face paling further. "Boone, didn't expect to see you riding this direction. News travels fast in small places, Boone replied, his gaze never leaving the wooden structure, especially news about stubborn animals and old burial grounds. Ezekiel felt tension crackling between his visitors like heat lightning before a storm. Burial grounds? This is ranch land. Has been for years. Boone smiled, but the expression held no warmth. Depends on what you mean by burial, friend. Some things get buried that weren't exactly meant for proper graves. The donkey brayed again, louder this time, backing away from all three humans. Dusty's distress seemed to be growing with each passing moment, as if the conversation itself was stirring something the animal desperately wanted to avoid. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Ezekiel demanded. Boone walked closer to the trough, close enough that Dusty bolted 20 feet away. "I'm suggesting that your donkey knows something we don't, and I'm thinking it's time we found out what Tobias Ward was so eager to keep hidden." He knelt beside the trough and pressed his palm against the earth. "Because I've got a feeling what's down there belonged to someone else first." Ezekiel's hand moved instinctively to the rifle strapped to his saddle. Something about Boone's manner set his nerves on edge. "This is my property, Carter. You don't get to decide what gets dug up here." Boone stood slowly, brushing dirt from his palm. "Your property, sure, but some debts run deeper than property lines, Marsh. Tobias Ward took something that didn't belong to him, something that belongs to my family." Clementine moved closer to her horse, ready to mount quickly if needed. "Boone, this isn't the way to handle old grievances." "Isn't it?" Boone's voice carried years of buried anger. "My grandfather died waiting for Ward to return what he stole. Died broken because that man took everything we had and buried it somewhere on this land." The pieces began forming a picture in Ezekiel's mind. "You think Ward buried stolen money under my water trough? Money, documents, who knows what else. But yes, I think your donkey is standing guard over something that rightfully belongs to the Carter family." Boone pointed at Dusty, who remained at a safe distance, ears flat against his head. "Animals can smell things humans can't. Smell old leather, metal, even human remains if they've been underground long enough. Human remains." The words hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. "You're saying Ward might have killed someone?" "I'm saying Ward disappeared for a reason, and it wasn't because he grew tired of the scenery." Boone walked around the trough, studying the ground from different angles. "My grandfather confronted Ward about the theft right before that winter. They had words. Bad words. Next thing anyone knew, both men were gone." Clementine's face had gone white as fresh snow. "Boone, you can't be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts." He knelt again, this time pressing his ear to the ground near the trough's base. "The earth here sounds different. Hollow, like something was excavated and filled back in." Ezekiel felt sweat forming despite the cool morning air. His peaceful ranch, his simple life, was suddenly transforming into something from a nightmare. "Even if you're right, even if something is buried here, what makes you think you have the right to dig it up?" Boone stood and faced him directly. "Because whatever's down there was stolen from my family 30 years ago, and because your donkey is telling us there's something wrong with this whole setup." As if responding to his name being mentioned, Dusty let out another sharp bray and pawed the ground nervously. The animal's distress was becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. "Fine," Ezekiel said finally, "but we do this right. We move the trough first, carefully, and if we find anything that looks like human remains, we stop immediately and get the sheriff." Boone nodded slowly. "Agreed. But we find what's mine. I'm taking it back." Clementine mounted her horse quickly. "I want no part of this. Some things should stay buried, Ezekiel. Mark my words." She rode away without looking back, leaving the two men staring at the wooden trough that suddenly seemed less like a water source and more like a marker over unknown graves. Boone walked to his horse and retrieved a shovel from his pack. "Let's see what your donkey has been trying to tell you." Moving the trough proved easier than expected. The wooden structure was heavy but well balanced, and with both men lifting, they managed to shift it 6 feet away from its original position. Underneath, the earth looked different from the surrounding soil. Darker, more compact, like it had been disturbed and packed down again. Dusty watched from his safe distance, no longer braying but standing perfectly still, as if waiting for something to be revealed. Ezekiel gripped his own shovel, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. "We start shallow. Easy strokes. If we hit anything that doesn't feel like normal dirt, we stop." Boone nodded and sank his blade into the earth. The first shovelful came up cleanly, revealing nothing but packed soil. The second cut deeper, and the sound changed. Instead of the clean slice through dirt, the shovel made a dull thunk against something solid. Both men froze. Metal, Boone whispered. Definitely metal. They worked more carefully now, using their hands to brush away loose soil. Within minutes, the outline of a metal box emerged. Old iron, roughly the size of a saddlebag, with a simple latch that had rusted shut over the years. Ezekiel's heart pounded as they freed the box from its earthen prison. It was heavier than expected, and something shifted inside when they lifted it. Not coins. Something wrapped in cloth or leather. "This is it," Boone breathed. "This has to be what Ward stole from my grandfather." They set the box on the ground between them. The rust flaked away easily as Boone worked at the latch with his knife. After several minutes of careful prying, the mechanism gave way with a sharp click. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had preserved its contents remarkably well, lay a leather portfolio tied with string. Beneath it, a small cloth bag that clinked softly when Boone lifted it. "Gold coins," he said. Untying the bag and pouring several pieces into his palm. "These are definitely from my grandfather's collection. He was a coin collector, specialized in pieces from the Mexican territories." Ezekiel watched as Boone examined each coin with the reverence of a man touching family heirlooms. The portfolio, however, remained unopened. "What's in the papers?" Ezekiel asked. Boone's hands hesitated over the leather ties. "Property deeds, most likely. My grandfather owned land all through this territory before Ward cheated him out of it." He untied the string and opened the portfolio carefully. His face went white as he read the first document. "This isn't about stolen property," he said quietly. "This is about murder." Ezekiel felt his blood turn cold. "What do you mean?" Boone held up a piece of paper covered in hurried handwriting. "It's a confession. Ward's confession. He killed my grandfather during their confrontation, then buried him and stole everything he owned." His voice cracked slightly. He wrote down where he buried the body. The implications hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. His peaceful ranch was built over a crime scene. Somewhere on his property lay the remains of an innocent man, killed for his possessions and buried in secret. Dusty suddenly brayed again, sharp and urgent. Both men looked up to see riders approaching from the east, 3 men on horseback, moving fast across the open ground toward them. "Who are they?" Ezekiel asked. Boone's face had gone grim. "Trouble. Those are Henderson's men, and if they're here, it means someone told them we were digging." The lead rider was close enough now that Ezekiel could make out his features. Not Henderson himself, but his foreman, Marcus Reed, a man known for solving problems with violence when words failed. "They're not here to talk," Boone said, standing and reaching for his rifle. "They're here to make sure this confession never sees daylight." Marcus Reed and his 2 companions reined in their horses 20 feet away. Close enough for conversation but far enough to avoid immediate conflict. Reed's hand rested casually on his gun belt, a subtle threat that wasn't lost on either Ezekiel or Boone. "Gentlemen," Reed called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Heard you were doing some excavation work out here. Thought we'd come see what treasures you might have uncovered." Ezekiel stepped protectively in front of the metal box. "This is private property, Reed. You have no business here." Reed's smile faded. "Actually, I think we do. See, Mr. Henderson has always been curious about what old Tobias might have left behind when he disappeared, and now it looks like his curiosity was justified." Boone raised his rifle slightly, not quite aiming but making his intentions clear. "Ward left behind evidence of murder, Reed. Evidence that's going to the sheriff whether Henderson likes it or not." "Is that so?" Reed dismounted slowly, his men following suit. "And what makes you think Henderson doesn't already know exactly what Ward did?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Ezekiel felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place in his mind. Henderson knew Ward killed Boone's grandfather. Henderson helped him cover it up, Reed replied casually. Ward was useful to certain business interests in the territory. Men like that don't just disappear without help. Boone's rifle came up fully now, aimed directly at Reed's chest. "You're saying Henderson was involved in my grandfather's murder?" "I'm saying Henderson made sure Ward's little problem got solved permanently. Ward got too nervous after the killing, started talking about confessing. So Henderson arranged for Ward to have his own disappearance. Permanent-like." The morning air seemed to thicken with tension. Dusty had moved even farther away, sensing the violence that was building like storm pressure. "So Henderson killed Ward too," Ezekiel said. "Business decision," Reed shrugged. Ward was a liability, but he was smart enough to hide his insurance policy before Henderson's men found him. He nodded toward the metal box. That confession was supposed to stay buried forever. Ezekiel realized the scope of what they'd uncovered. Not just a simple theft and murder, but a conspiracy involving one of the most powerful men in the territory. Henderson had built his land empire partially on murder and cover-ups. Which brings us to our current problem, Reed continued. You boys have dug up something that could cause Mr. Henderson considerable embarrassment. Now, we can handle this easy, or we can handle this hard. What's the easy way? Ezekiel asked, though he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. You put that box back in the ground, fill in the hole, move your trough back where it belongs, and forget this whole thing ever happened. In exchange, you keep breathing. Boone's jaws set with determination. And the hard way? Reed's hand moved to his gun. The hard way involves explaining to folks how you both died in a tragic accident while trying to steal from each other. Behind Reed, his two men had spread out slightly, creating a triangle that would make it difficult for Ezekiel and Boone to watch all three simultaneously. The positioning was tactical, professional. These weren't just ranch hands. They were killers. You're making a mistake, Reed, Boone said steadily. Clementine Ross knows we're here. She knows what we found. Kill us, and you'll just have more witnesses to silence. Reed's smile returned, cold and confident. Cold. Who says we haven't already paid Mrs. Ross a visit? The words hit like a punch to the gut. If Henderson's men had hurt Clementine. Time to decide, gentlemen, Reed said, his hand now resting on his gun grip. Easy way or hard way. But either way, that confession goes back in the ground today. Ezekiel's mind raced through their options. None of them good. 3 armed men against 2, with nowhere to run and no cover except the moved water trough. But before he could formulate a plan, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the west. Sheriff Thomas Whitley rode hard across the ranch, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Behind him came 2 deputies, all 3 men armed and ready for trouble. Reed's confident expression flickered for the first time. Sheriff, wasn't expecting to see you out this way. Whitley dismounted with authority, his sharp eyes taking in the scene immediately. The moved trough, the excavated hole, the metal box, and 3 obvious sides forming for a gunfight. Mrs. Ross came to town this morning, Whitley said, his hand resting on his gun. Said there might be trouble brewing out at the Marsh place. Looks like she was right. Reed tried to regain his composure. Just a simple property dispute. Sheriff, these men were trespassing and digging where they shouldn't. That's so. Whitley walked over to examine the metal box and its contents. His weathered face grew grim as he read Ward's confession. Marcus, you and your boys need to mount up and ride back to Henderson, now. I'm afraid I can't do that. Sheriff, Reed's voice hardened. This is Henderson business, and it's going to stay Henderson business. Whitley straightened slowly, and Ezekiel saw decades of law enforcement experience in the man's steady gaze. You threatening a peace officer, Reed? I'm stating facts. That confession never leaves this ranch. The sheriff's deputies had spread out flanking Reed's men, evening the odds considerably. But Ezekiel knew that in a gunfight, even good odds could turn deadly in seconds. Here's what's going to happen, Whitley said calmly. This confession is evidence in a murder case. It's coming with me to town, where it's going to be properly filed and investigated. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with a judge. Reed's hand moved closer to his gun. Henderson's not going to like that, Sheriff. Henderson can file an official complaint if he has concerns about my handling of evidence. Whitley's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. But right now you're interfering with a criminal investigation. Boone still held his rifle trained on Reed, but Ezekiel could see the strain in his posture. The man had been searching for justice for his grandfather's death his entire life, and now it hung in the balance of a confrontation that could go wrong in a heartbeat. Dusty, who had remained distant throughout the standoff, suddenly brayed loudly and began moving toward the group. The donkey approached slowly but deliberately, as if sensing that the immediate danger was shifting. Stand down, Reed, one of Whitley's deputies called out. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Reed looked around at the faces surrounding him, calculating odds and outcomes. His men looked nervous, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of shooting it out with law enforcement officers. This isn't over, Reed said finally, his hand moving away from his weapon. Henderson's got friends in high places. That confession might not mean as much as you think. Maybe, Whitley replied, but it means enough to start asking the right questions. And once people start asking questions about Henderson's business practices, they might find more answers than he's comfortable with. Reed mounted his horse with obvious reluctance. You're making enemies you can't afford, Sheriff. I've been making enemies like Henderson my whole career, Whitley said. Hasn't killed me yet. As Reed and his men rode away, Ezekiel felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. But he knew this was far from over. Sheriff Whitley carefully wrapped Ward's confession in oiled cloth and secured it in his saddlebag. This document is going straight to the territorial judge. Boone, I'll need you to come to town and give a formal statement about your grandfather's disappearance. Boone nodded, still gripping his rifle but with visible relief replacing the tension in his face. What about Henderson? You think he'll try to stop this from going to trial? Henderson's been walking a thin line for years, Whitley replied. This might be the evidence we need to finally bring him down, but he won't go quietly. Ezekiel looked around his ranch, which suddenly felt less like home and more like the center of a storm that was far from over. What happens to my property? If there are bodies buried here, we'll need to excavate properly. With witnesses and official documentation, the sheriff's expression was sympathetic but firm. Your ranch might be a crime scene for a while, Ezekiel, but the truth needs to come out. Dusty had approached close enough to nuzzle Ezekiel's shoulder, as if sensing his distress. The donkey's behavior had returned to normal now that the immediate threat was gone. But Ezekiel would never look at his water trough the same way again. There's something else, Whitley continued. Ward's confession mentions other properties, other deals that Henderson was involved in. If this opens up a full investigation, we might find that half the land transactions in this territory were built on murder and theft. One of the deputies rode up quickly from the direction Reed's men had taken. Sheriff, they're not heading back to Henderson's ranch. They split up and are riding toward town from different directions. Whitley's face darkened. They're going to try to get to Henderson before we do. Warn him about what we found. He turned to his other deputy. Ride hard to town. I want Henderson under watch before sunset. If he tries to leave the territory, arrest him. As the deputy galloped away, Ezekiel felt the weight of what they'd set in motion. This was no longer about a donkey refusing water, or even about solving an old murder. This was about dismantling a criminal empire that had operated in shadow for decades. What about Mrs. Ross? Boone asked. Reed implied they might have heard her. Clementine's safe, Whitley assured them. I had her moved to the hotel in town under protection after she told me what was happening here. She knew more about Ward's activities than she let on. Relief washed over Ezekiel. At least Clementine was out of harm's way. You boys did good work here today, the sheriff continued. But this fight is just beginning. Henderson has money, influence, and men willing to kill to protect his interests. Until this goes to trial, you're both going to be targets. Ezekiel watched as Dusty wandered back toward the displaced water trough, no longer showing any signs of distress about the area. It was as if the donkey knew that the secret buried beneath had finally been revealed, and the danger it represented was no longer hidden. I've got a proposition, Whitley said. Both of you come to town with me. Stay under protection until we can get this sorted out legal-like. Henderson's reach is long, but he won't try anything in the middle of town with witnesses. Boone nodded immediately. I've waited 30 years for justice. I'm not backing down now. Ezekiel looked around his ranch one more time, knowing that everything was about to change. The peaceful life he'd built here was over, at least for now. But the truth demanded its price, and some prices were worth paying. All right, Sheriff, he said finally. Let's finish what we started. But as they prepared to leave, none of them noticed the lone rider watching from the distant ridge, or the way he turned his horse and disappeared into the hills with news that would reach Henderson long before they reached town. They reached town just as the sun hit its peak, but Henderson was already gone. His ranch house stood empty, windows dark, with clear signs of a hasty departure. Clothes scattered, safes emptied, and horse tracks leading north toward the territorial border. Coward ran, Boone said with bitter satisfaction. But running is as good as a confession. Sheriff Whitley organized search parties immediately, but everyone knew Henderson had hours of head start. Still, the territorial marshals would be notified, and a man like Henderson would find it difficult to disappear completely. More importantly, Henderson's flight left his entire criminal network exposed. Over the following days, as word spread about Ward's confession and the buried evidence, other victims came forward. Families who had lost land through mysterious circumstances, business partners who had disappeared, widows who had never received promised payments. The excavation of Ezekiel's ranch revealed exactly what Ward's confession had promised. Boone's grandfather's remains were found in a shallow grave near the creek, along with personal effects that confirmed his identity. After 30 years, the old man finally received a proper burial. Boone stood at the graveside as the last shovel of dirt was thrown. "Thank you," he said to Ezekiel. "If your donkey hadn't refused that water." Ezekiel nodded, watching Dusty graze peacefully in the distance. The donkey had saved them all by trusting instincts that ran deeper than human understanding. The trial, when it finally happened, lasted 3 days. Ward's confession, combined with physical evidence and testimony from multiple witnesses, painted a clear picture of Henderson's criminal empire. Though Henderson himself remained a fugitive, his associates were convicted and sentenced. Several property deeds were reversed, returning stolen land to rightful owners or their descendants. Boone inherited back his grandfather's original property, acres of good grazing land that had been lost to Henderson's schemes decades earlier. He offered to buy Ezekiel's ranch at a fair price, knowing his friend might want to start fresh somewhere without the memory of buried bodies. But Ezekiel surprised him by declining. "This land has seen enough running away," he said. "Time it had someone willing to stay and build something honest." He moved the water trough to a new location, far from the excavation site, and built a small monument where his grandfather's grave had been found. Dusty approved of the new arrangement, drinking readily from the relocated trough without hesitation. Word of their discovery spread throughout the territory. Ezekiel's ranch became known as the place where one man's honesty and a donkey's wisdom brought down a criminal empire. Visitors came regularly to hear the story, and many stayed to do business with a man they knew could be trusted. Clementine Ross returned to her home, no longer afraid to speak about the dark secrets she'd carried for years. She visited Ezekiel's ranch weekly, sharing stories about the territory's history and helping him understand the legacy he'd inherited. Sheriff Whitley received a commendation from the territorial governor for his handling of the Henderson case. He often stopped by the ranch to check on Ezekiel and to remind him that sometimes the smallest observations led to the most important discoveries. Boone Carter became a prosperous rancher on his recovered family land, but he never forgot the debt he owed to Ezekiel and Dusty. He made sure everyone in the territory knew that honest men and wise animals had triumphed over corruption and murder. And Dusty? The donkey continued his daily routine, drinking from the new trough without complaint, carrying loads without protest, and serving as a reminder that sometimes the most important truths are discovered by paying attention to things others might dismiss as unimportant. Henderson was eventually captured trying to cross into Mexico and returned for trial. He died in territorial prison 5 years later, his empire scattered and his victims finally at peace. Ezekiel Marsh's ranch became a symbol of justice in a land where justice had been rare. And every morning, as he watched Dusty drink peacefully from the water trough, he remembered that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried or how long it takes to find. The past was finally at rest, and the future stretched ahead with the promise that honest work and careful attention could build something lasting and good. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and determination unlock secrets that changed everything in the Old West. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
Every night an old golden retriever disappeared into the dark woods, and every morning he came back with something small, cold, and trembling in his mouth. At first, his owner thought he was just chasing strays, but when she finally followed him one rainy night, what she discovered behind her neighbor's mansion broke her heart and restored her faith in miracles. If you've ever believed that angels walk among us sometimes on 4 legs, this story will speak to your soul. The village of Willow Grove, nestled quietly in the rolling hills of Vermont, had begun to turn gold. The first kiss of autumn painted the maple trees with soft hues of amber and flame. Leaves floated gently to the ground, creating a carpet that crunched lightly underfoot. A breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and apples mingling with the earthy musk of the season's first rain. The mornings had grown cooler, and the sun dipped below the horizon a little earlier each day, as if nature itself was slowly curling inward to rest. On the edge of town, in a modest 2-story cottage with faded green shutters and a wraparound porch wrapped in ivy, lived Helen Whitaker, a retired schoolteacher with silver-streaked hair, always tied neatly into a bun, a preference for knitted cardigans, and a soul both gentle and iron-willed. At 72, Helen moved with a grace earned from decades spent at the chalkboard and afternoons tending her late husband's rose garden. Her voice was soft, often carrying the warmth of stories long tucked away, but her gaze remained sharp and unwavering. A woman who had loved deeply, lost deeply, and now cherished the stillness of everyday kindness. Her companion of the last 7 years was Charlie, a 10-year-old golden retriever with honey-colored fur and warm eyes the shade of toasted chestnuts. Charlie was the kind of dog who seemed to smile whenever he walked, tail swinging like a lazy metronome, eyes always watching, always waiting. Helen had rescued him from a flooded roadside shelter during a harsh spring storm. Ever since, he'd rarely left her side. In the quiet rhythm of their lives, Charlie was more than a pet. He was her shadow, her confidant, and often her reason to rise with the sun. But lately, something had shifted. 3 nights in a row, Helen had awoken to the sound of the back door creaking. Each time she'd found it left ajar by inches, swaying slightly in the morning wind. At first, she blamed the latch. Her house was old, and locks sometimes played tricks. But then she began to notice Charlie's fur, damp, speckled with mud, smelling faintly of damp leaves and river moss. His paws left small trails of dirt across the kitchen floor. Yet when she questioned him, he only sat, tail thudding gently, eyes steady, saying nothing in that solemn way dogs do. That morning, Helen stood by the kitchen window with a mug of black tea, watching Charlie sleep by the hearth. His breathing was deep and even, but there was a tension to his body now, like a string pulled tight even in rest. The fire crackled beside him, a few golden leaves blown inside the house clung to his back unnoticed. Helen turned to the dining table and saw the pale blue envelope once again addressed in elegant handwriting, the kind rarely seen these days. It had arrived 2 days ago and still lay unopened like a relic. To Miss Helen Whitaker, from Greenwood Academy, Alumni Association. Subject, 50th Reunion. Class of 1975. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. A reunion. A gathering of old smiles and older regrets. Helen hadn't stepped foot into Greenwood Academy since the day she packed up her desk in 1998, long after she'd become a teacher herself there. But the memory that lingered wasn't of her time as a teacher. It was from far earlier 1975, when she and Doris Harland had stood side by side, thick as sisters, in the ivy-covered hallways. Until the day they weren't. The fracture had been sharp, painful, and in Helen's mind never quite healed. Doris had walked away from that friendship without a word, leaving Helen in the storm of rumors that followed. She'd never asked why. Now, decades later, the past arrived in the form of a blue envelope resting on a table that still bore the faint scent of lemon polish and cinnamon. Charlie stirred. His ears twitched. Then slowly he stood and padded over to the door. His nose pressed against the wood. A low, almost imperceptible whine escaped him. Helen frowned, walked to the door, and opened it just wide enough to peek out. The yard was still wet from the evening rain. The sun was barely breaking through the clouds. Charlie nudged past her, trotting into the backyard with a strange urgency. She called after him, but he didn't stop. Instead, he darted toward the hedgerow near the forest line, tail high, eyes alert. By the time Helen pulled on her coat and rubber boots and followed, Charlie had vanished. She walked the perimeter of the backyard, calling his name. Her boots sank slightly into the wet earth. When she rounded the corner of the garage, she found him half covered in fallen leaves, pawing at the soil near the edge of the tool shed. Dirt flew behind him in frantic bursts. Helen called his name sharply. He paused, turned to look at her, and whimpered. She knelt beside him, brushing back the loose dirt. That's when she saw it, a small tuft of gray fur, matted and shaking. A kitten barely old enough to walk, buried in the damp earth, and leaves too weak to cry. Helen gasped and lifted the creature gently into her hands. It was ice cold, its ribs visible beneath thin skin. Charlie sat beside her, his breath steaming in the cool air. He leaned forward and licked the kitten's head once gently like a benediction. Helen rose quickly, clutching the kitten to her chest. Inside, she wrapped it in one of her husband's old flannel shirts and set it by the fire. Charlie lay beside it, eyes alert. As Helen warmed some milk in a dropper, her heart pounded with questions. Why had Charlie found the kitten? And how did he know it was there? And more importantly, was this the first, or just the first she had seen? The next evening in Willow Grove was wrapped in a misty calm. A light drizzle had fallen earlier in the afternoon, and now a low fog settled across the fields like a woolen blanket. Street lamps glowed amber through the haze, casting long, blurred shadows on the cobbled streets. From her window, Helen watched droplets collect and roll down the pane, her hand resting on the sill fingers, absent-mindedly tracing the glass. In the corner of the living room, Charlie lay curled tightly around the kitten they'd found the day before, which now slept inside a shallow basket lined with towels and the scent of firewood and warmth. Helen had named her Misty after the weather in which she'd been saved. The little creature had survived the night, though barely, and still needed to be fed with a dropper every 3 hours. Charlie had not left her side. Helen hadn't told anyone yet. Not the neighbors, not the vet, not the local animal shelter. A part of her felt strangely protective, as if the discovery of Misty had uncovered more than just a kitten. It had stirred something long dormant in her. A need to act, a sense of unfinished purpose. That afternoon, she'd finally opened the envelope from Greenwood Academy. As she expected, it was a formal invitation to the 50th class reunion with a printed list of confirmed guests on fine cream-colored paper. She skimmed the names, some unfamiliar, others stirring vague memories. Then she saw it Doris Harland. The name hit her like a cold wind. Doris had once been the light in Helen's teenage years, tall, spirited, with wild auburn curls, and a laugh that drew people like bees to blossoms. They had been inseparable until that one winter night, when a cruel misunderstanding, made worse by whispers and pride, tore them apart. Doris had left town soon after. There had been no phone calls, no letters. Helen had often wondered if she had simply vanished on purpose. Now, all these years later, the possibility of seeing her again brought a mix of dread and longing Helen couldn't fully untangle. Charlie lifted his head, ears perked. He stood suddenly, his body tense. Then, without sound, he padded to the door. Helen watched something uneasy stirring in her chest. She set down her teacup and followed as Charlie pushed his nose against the wood. "You're not doing this again?" she murmured, reaching for her raincoat. The fog outside had thickened. "Not without me." She followed him through the backyard, past the garden, past the old swing that still creaked faintly even when no wind blew. Charlie moved with purpose, head low, tail straight. His paws barely made a sound on the wet grass. Helen gripped a flashlight, its yellow beam cutting through the fog like a small sun. Charlie led her down the narrow trail that curved along the border of the property where the tall pines stood in a silent row like sentinels. They reached a rusted wire fence, and just beyond it loomed the edge of the Blackwell estate. The Blackwell house stood like a forgotten castle, 3 stories of crumbling gray stone with tall windows and black shutters that hadn't opened in years. Ivy grew wild across its facade. The estate had been the subject of whispers for decades. Locals said Everett Blackwell, the current heir, was rarely seen and always alone. Everett was in his 60s, tall and thin, with a gaunt face and permanently downturned lips. His hair was silver, always slicked back, and he wore suits even when trimming hedges when he still did such things. He'd inherited the house from his uncle and never married. Helen had seen him only a handful of times, usually in town, collecting mail or standing silently at the edge of a church funeral. Charlie crept toward a thick patch of overgrown hedges near the southeast corner of the estate. Helen followed carefully. Suddenly, she heard a faint, high-pitched cry, almost drowned by the trickling sound of water. Charlie barked once, short and urgent, then dropped to his belly and began nosing beneath a rotted plank. Helen got closer and saw the source, a narrow storm drain that ran along the edge of the property hidden by brush. Something was stuck inside. She crouched, aimed her flashlight inside. Her breath caught. Another kitten. This one was darker, soaked to the skin, wedged between a loose grate and a tangle of leaves and debris. Its eyes were wide with fear, one paw moving weakly. The water, shallow but fast, rushed beneath its body. Helen didn't hesitate. She tugged off her gloves, reached in with one hand while Charlie stood guard, barking now to keep something or someone at bay. Her fingers slipped on the wet iron, and for a moment she feared she'd lost her grip, but then she caught the kitten by the scruff and pulled it free. It shivered violently in her palm. Behind her, a door slammed. Helen whirled. From the back veranda of the Blackwell house, Everett Blackwell stood watching. His posture was ramrod straight, one hand gripping the railing. His face was shadowed, but his voice cut through the fog like a blade. "What are you doing on my property?" Helen rose slowly, cradling the kitten in one arm. "Saving a life," she answered simply. Everett said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned, disappearing into the house without a word. Helen looked down at the kitten, then at Charlie, who was still watching the veranda warily. Without another glance back, she made her way home, heart pounding not from fear, but from a strange certainty this wouldn't be the last. The following afternoon was unusually warm for early October in Willow Grove. The mist from the day before had lifted, revealing a sky so clear it looked painted. Sunlight poured through the golden branches, and the gentle wind carried with it the scent of cut grass pine, and something fainter, perhaps the memory of summer slipping away. Helen Whitaker stood on her back porch with a mug of tea in hand, watching Charlie patrol the edge of the yard. He was unusually restless today, tail rigid, head low, occasionally stopping to sniff the wind or the fence line. Inside, both Misty and the second kitten, now named Pepper for his charcoal gray fur, were resting in a makeshift corner sanctuary Helen had arranged beside the fireplace. She'd spent the morning warming milk, gently brushing mud from their coats, and softly speaking to them, as if her words alone might undo the harshness they had endured. Charlie had found Pepper just in time. The poor thing had barely moved since being pulled from the drainpipe, but that morning he lifted his head and blinked at her. It had been a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The woodshop behind the Blackwell property had once belonged to Everett's father. Back when Helen's husband was still alive, he used to buy lumber there, fine Vermont maple, carefully milled. These days, the building was falling into disrepair. Its tin roof had rusted. One shutter dangled askew, and ivy coiled tightly around the lower frame like nature reclaiming her due. Charlie suddenly barked short and sharp, then took off across the yard, nosing open the old side gate. Helen sighed, pulled on her boots, and followed. By the time she caught up, he was already at the edge of the Blackwell fence, pacing. His ears twitched as he listened. Then he turned and began digging his paws, flinging aside leaves and moss just beneath the workshop window. Helen crouched beside him. The smell hit first wet wood decay and something fainter but unmistakable animal waste. "Charlie, wait," she started, but he was already halfway through a loose plank at the foundation. With a grunt and some reluctance, Helen slipped inside after him. The workshop's interior was dim shafts of sunlight cutting through the cracks in the walls like golden blades. Dust danced in the air and the smell intensified. Then came the sound, barely audible at first, a trembling mule. Charlie moved toward a large, overturned workbench, paused, then barked. Helen stepped forward and froze. Behind the workbench, in the shadow of stacked crates, lay two tiny kittens. One was cream-colored with faint orange stripes, the other completely black. Both huddled together, eyes wide, their ribs visible through wet fur. A soggy piece of cardboard and a broken saucer lay beside them. Helen scooped them up gently, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "How long have you been here?" she whispered. "And who would leave you like this?" Charlie stayed close, tail swaying slowly. The golden fur on his muzzle brushed against the kittens as if assuring them they were safe now. Later that evening, after bathing and feeding the two newcomers, whom she now called Butterscotch and Midnight, Helen sat at her kitchen table with the landline pressed between her ear and shoulder, trying to reach the nearest vet with space. As the hold music played, a small knock came from the front porch. She opened the door to find a boy standing there, one hand clutched around a sketch pad, his jeans stained with dirt and a streak of green paint running up one sleeve. He looked no older than 10. His dark blonde hair curled over his ears, and he wore a threadbare hoodie 2 sizes too big. "Hi," he said shyly, eyes shifting past her to the house beyond. "I'm Caleb. I live down the road. I saw your dog in the woods earlier. Is he okay?" Helen studied him for a moment. "Charlie's fine. Come in, Caleb." He hesitated, then stepped inside. As soon as he spotted the kittens, his face lit up. He knelt beside their basket, watching Butterscotch bat gently at a string. "I thought maybe something happened," he said. "You've been out near the Blackwell place." "You know it?" Helen asked, gently pouring 2 glasses of lemonade. "Yeah. Sometimes I go there to draw," Caleb replied. "It's quiet. Nobody ever bothers me there. My dad says it's just a bunch of junk." Helen handed him the glass. "Where's your dad now?" "Probably asleep," he said with a shrug. "He works nights. Doesn't like when I make noise." There was a softness in Caleb's voice, but also something carefully restrained, like a bird too often startled. Helen noticed the way he looked at the kittens with wonder, but also longing. "Do you want to help me take care of them?" she asked. His face brightened. "Could I really? You'd be doing me a favor." He beamed. "Charlie's a really good dog," he added, glancing at the golden retriever who lay beside the kittens like a guardian angel. "He always comes up to me when I'm by the lake." Helen's gaze softened. "He seems to like you." For the next hour, Caleb helped clean bedding and refill water bowls. Before leaving, he pulled a folded sketch from his bag and handed it to Helen. It was of Charlie sitting beside a basket of kittens beneath a maple tree, the sky behind glowing gold and red. "I drew it last week," he said. "I didn't know where he was going, but I think now I do." The moon hung low and pale over Willow Grove, veiled by drifting clouds that made the light shimmer like breath on glass. It was well past midnight, and the world had settled into a hush that only the countryside could hold. Crickets played their quiet song through the hedgerows, and far in the distance the sound of an owl echoed across the hills. Helen Whitaker stood on her porch in a wool cardigan, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea. Inside the fireplace crackled softly. 4 kittens, Misty Pepper, Butterscotch and Midnight were curled in warm nests along the hearth, their tiny bodies rising and falling in rhythmic sleep. Charlie lay beside them, ever watchful, his head rising slightly every time the wind shifted. Helen felt a growing unease that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the cats, or the odd disappearances, or even the cold gaze of Everett Blackwell when she'd locked eyes with him across his decaying veranda. It was something deeper, an ache she couldn't name. Something had awakened in her life again, purpose perhaps, or sorrow. Charlie suddenly stood, his body stiffened, ears swiveling toward the east fence. He padded silently to the back door and whined once. Helen didn't need more prompting. She slipped on her boots, grabbed her flashlight, and followed. They crossed the yard quickly. The frost-tipped grass crunched beneath her feet. Charlie moved with certainty, his golden fur almost glowing in the moonlight. They passed the edge of her property and crept along the wooded path that bordered the Blackwell estate. The trail narrowed there, lined with tall cedar and birch trees that swayed gently in the night breeze. Up ahead, Charlie stopped. There, crouched at the edge of the woods, was a woman. She wore a long wool coat over a house dress, and her hands were trembling as she adjusted a box at her feet. Helen flicked off her flashlight and stepped closer, her heart tightening. The box moved just barely. Then a faint mew echoed in the stillness. The woman stiffened as Charlie barked once. She turned sharply, startled. Helen recognized her immediately, Maribel. Maribel Cortez was in her early 50s, with dark hair streaked with gray, and kind, weary eyes that had once smiled easily but now carried shadows. She was short and slightly hunched, the curve in her shoulders, not from age but from years of carrying burdens, silently. She had worked for Everett Blackwell since her 20s, caring for the estate after his uncle died. People in town rarely spoke of her, mostly because they rarely saw her. "Mrs. Whitaker." Maribel's voice was thin, barely louder than the rustle of leaves. Helen stepped closer. "What are you doing out here?" Maribel looked down at the box. A small paw slipped over the edge, then fell back. I was trying to do the right thing," she whispered. Helen knelt, peered inside. 3 kittens no older than a few weeks blinked up at her with crusted eyes. One mewed pitifully. "I couldn't do it," Maribel said. Her words cracked as tears spilled over her cheeks. "He told me to drown them. Said they were unsuitable, not show-worthy. He doesn't want them to grow and make a mess." Helen felt her stomach twist. "He breeds them?" she asked quietly. Maribel nodded. "Pedigree. For wealthy buyers out of state. He keeps the perfect ones. The others, he makes me get rid of." She lowered her head as shame rippled through her voice. "I used to try to take them to shelters, but he checks. He always checks. If he finds out I didn't, he said he'd fire me. I've worked there my whole life. I have no savings, nowhere else to go." Charlie nudged her gently as if trying to comfort her. "I couldn't do it tonight," she went on. "I told myself I'd leave them here. Maybe a fox would find them, or someone like you." Her hands trembled. "I'm sorry." Helen said nothing for a moment. Then she reached down, picked up the box, and held it against her chest. The kittens barely stirred. "Then we don't leave them," she said. "Come on." They walked back in silence. Once inside, Helen set the box beside the fire. Maribel stood awkwardly by the door, her hands twisting her coat buttons. Helen handed her a towel. "You can help me clean them," she said simply. For the next hour, the 2 women worked in quiet focus, warming the kittens, feeding them with drops of milk, wiping dirt from their matted fur. Charlie stayed nearby, occasionally resting his nose gently beside the box. When they finished, Maribel looked over the sleeping pile and whispered, "Their mother died last week. Complications." Helen didn't ask for more. As Maribel stood to leave, Helen asked, "Why not leave him?" "Report him." Maribel shook her head slowly. "I wouldn't win. He has friends. Influence. And I'm nobody." Helen looked at her steadily. "You are someone to them," she said, motioning to the sleeping kittens. Maribel paused at the door. If you need to know more, come by when he's out. Fridays late afternoon, he goes into town to drink with the lawyer." Helen nodded. Then the door closed and Maribel vanished into the night. The house was silent once more. Helen returned to the fire, sat beside Charlie. She stared at the kittens, now 7 in total. They breathed gently in sleep, unaware of the cruelty they had narrowly escaped. She didn't know what she would do next, but she knew she wouldn't do nothing. Friday arrived with a chill that clung to the bones. The sky over Willow Grove was a washed-out gray, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Helen Whitaker stood in her mudroom lacing up her boots with hands that trembled only slightly. Beside her, Charlie waited, tail-still gaze, focused. He seemed to know something was different about today. The air inside the house had grown heavy. There were now 10 kittens sleeping quietly in baskets and blankets across the living room, and Helen had made a chart just to remember their names. Misty Pepper Butterscotch Midnight. The 3 Maribel had nearly abandoned, and 2 more that Charlie had led her to just that morning, both found mewling behind the trash bins near the post office. Their fur was patchy and eyes glassy, but they were alive, just barely. She wrapped a scarf around her neck, tucked a flashlight into her coat, and slipped a folded notepad into her purse. At exactly 3:55 p.m., she met Maribel by the hedgerow behind the Blackwell estate. The house loomed before them like something out of an old Gothic novel, its towering windows, shuttered vines curling around the second-floor balconies like bony fingers. The grounds were silent save for the soft caw of a crow in the pine above. "He left 10 minutes ago," Maribel whispered. "Same as always. He'll be in town at Delaney's drinking gin until sundown." Maribel wore the same coat from before, her hair tucked under a knitted hat. Her expression was taut, her lips pressed into a line that trembled at the edges. "I don't have long." Helen nodded. Charlie followed closely behind them as Maribel led them through the side garden, past the cracked fountain shaped like a lion's head, and toward the rear door beneath the kitchen window. She unlocked it with a trembling key, then gestured Helen and the dog inside. The house smelled of cedar and something fainter, disinfectant and bleach. The air was cold. Everything was quiet, too quiet, like the silence had been curated. Maribel paused at a door just off the hallway near the old servant's pantry. "He always keeps this locked," she said, pulling a key from her pocket. "I've only been down twice. He said never to speak of it." The door creaked open. The stairs were narrow, wooden, and steep. Helen descended slowly, one hand on the rail, the other gripping her flashlight. Charlie padded behind her paws, silent against the old planks. The basement smelled worse than she expected, mussed mildew and something sharp and sickly sweet. The light from above dimmed until only Helen's flashlight cut through the gloom. At the bottom, the space opened into a long, low-ceilinged room, lined with old shelving and faded furniture covered in white sheets. But what caught Helen's eye was the row of metal cages against the far wall. 6 kittens. They huddled in separate cages too small to share space. One let out a hoarse cry as she approached. Another didn't move at all. There was a large porcelain tub in the center of the room, beside it neatly folded towels, and a small brown bottle half filled with pale liquid. A label read phenobarbital, a heavy sedative used in both medicine and euthanasia. Helen's stomach churned. She turned to Maribel, whose face had gone pale. He was going to kill them. Maribel nodded, voice shaking. "He said it's cleaner, easier. No one asks questions if they don't know to look." Helen moved quickly, opening cage doors, lifting trembling bodies, and placing them in the woven carrier bag she'd brought. Charlie sat guard by the stairs, tail curled tight, his posture rigid. His eyes watched every corner, every shadow. "I have to ask?" Helen said quietly, as she cradled the last kitten, no more than 4 weeks old, with matted ginger fur and a limp hind leg. "Why does he do this?" Maribel hesitated. Then she said, "You were a teacher, weren't you?" Helen nodded. "Still am in my bones." "He talks about you sometimes," Maribel said, "not by name, but he says they always pitied me, pretended to care, but they never saw what mattered." Helen froze. She looked back toward the stairs where dim light spilled through the slats. What was his name back then? Everett M. Blackwell. Helen felt something jolt in her chest. She remembered him now. Not clearly at first, just a thin boy with hollow cheeks and dark eyes that never looked up. Everett had been in her 4th grade class during her first year teaching at Greenwood Elementary. His father was a banker stern and always neatly dressed, who never came to school events but always made time to complain about his son's grades. Everett had struggled brilliant in abstract thought but terrified of failure. He once cried when he couldn't draw a straight line on an art assignment. Helen had gently encouraged him, but the next day he came in with a black eye and refused to speak. She'd reported it, but nothing had come of it. Back then, things were different. The system was slower and quieter. "I thought he moved away," she murmured. "He stayed," Maribel said. "Grew cold, grew careful. He doesn't trust love or mercy, he only trusts control." Helen nodded, blinking hard. She looked at the 6 tiny lives now bundled into the bag at her feet. Then we take back what he never learned. As they climbed the stairs, Helen paused. "I'll come back," she said. "This isn't over." Maribel gripped her wrist. "Be careful. He always knows more than he lets on." That night, back in the warmth of her home, Helen fed the new arrivals in silence. Charlie watched closely, resting his chin on the edge of the basket tail, thumping once every few seconds. She ran her fingers gently over the ginger kitten's fragile spine. "Your name," she whispered, "is Ember." A flicker of hope. A spark that survives the cold. The morning after their return from Everett's basement, Willow Grove shimmered beneath a veil of early frost. The sun had barely risen, casting long beams of light between the golden trees, and the world seemed hushed, as though waiting for something to break the stillness. Helen Whitaker stood on the porch, a steaming mug of tea in her hands, watching Charlie sniff the perimeter of the yard. His movements were focused, deliberate. He paused by the east fence, ears twitching before bounding toward the old well near the garden shed. Helen narrowed her eyes. The well hadn't been used in years, its stonework mostly intact, but the wooden cover warped by seasons of rain and snow. As Helen approached, she heard the sound, high-pitched, frantic, unmistakably feline. She set down her mug and broke into a jog. Charlie was already circling the well, barking short and low. Helen knelt beside it, peering into the dark. About 5 feet down, caught in a tangled mess of leaves and spider webs, was a tiny kitten, barely old enough to open its eyes, its ginger fur slick with dew. It mewed hoarsely, front paws scrambling against the stone. "Charlie, stay," she murmured, pulling her phone from her coat pocket. But she wasn't calling for help. She was calling Caleb. The boy arrived less than 10 minutes later, cheeks red, his hoodie thrown over mismatched pajamas and a sketchbook still tucked under one arm. "You said it was urgent," he panted, dropping to his knees. His eyes widened as he saw the kitten. "Oh no." Helen handed him a flashlight. "I'm going down. You'll steady the rope." Caleb nodded, face pale but resolute. For someone only 10, there was something steady and sure about him, like an old soul in a young frame. He held the end of the thick garden rope while Helen slowly lowered herself into the well, her feet braced against the stone as she descended one step at a time. It was damp, but not deep. Within minutes, she had the kitten wrapped in her scarf and tucked against her chest. When she climbed out, Caleb snapped a quick photo. "Proof we saved him," he said with a proud smile. Helen gave a soft laugh. "You're becoming quite the documentarian." He shrugged. "Sometimes I post stuff. Art, mostly. Maybe. This one, too." She nodded. "Go ahead. Just be thoughtful." Later that day, as the kitten now named Rusty slept curled against Charlie's tail, Helen's phone buzzed again. Caleb had sent her a link. "Local hero pup saves kitten from old well." The video, only 37 seconds long, showed Helen climbing from the well, the kitten in her arms, and Charlie wagging his tail like a furry knight in golden armor. The caption read, "Rescue dog. Charlie strikes again. Willow Grove. Our kindness matters." By noon, it had over 4,000 views. By dinner, it had passed 10,000. Helen had never gone viral before. The comments were filled with prayers, heart emojis, and people asking if they could donate. Someone tagged a local animal welfare group. A woman in Georgia offered to adopt the kitten. A veterinarian from Boston offered free exams for all animals in Helen's care. And just like that, the quiet work of saving one life at a time had caught fire. That evening, as Helen settled in by the fire with Charlie at her feet and Rusty purring in her lap, the phone rang. She didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. "Hello, Helen." The voice was softer than she remembered, but carried the same distinct cadence like a breeze brushing through dry leaves. "Doris," Helen whispered. There was a pause. "Then I saw the video." Caleb's post. I wasn't sure it was really you until I saw the dog. That same stubborn kind dog I saw you walking back in June. I thought maybe it couldn't be. Helen smiled, though her throat tightened. It's me. They were quiet for a long moment. Then Doris said, I never wrote. I should have. After, you know. I should have spoken up, Helen replied. I saw what they did. I saw how it hurt you. And I stayed silent. Doris exhaled slowly. We were kids. But that silence, it stayed with me. Mine too, Helen said, her voice barely audible. That's why I do this. The kittens, the rescues. It feels like a small way to make peace with the parts of myself I ignored. You've always had a big heart, Doris said, even when you were quiet. I'm glad the world is seeing it now. Helen blinked back tears. I wish it hadn't taken me so long. It doesn't matter, Doris replied gently. You showed up. And that's everything. They talked for nearly an hour about Greenwood, about their parents, about the long bridge of years that neither had crossed until now. As the call ended, Helen felt something loosen inside her. Not grief, not regret, just a quiet, warm kind of release. That night, as Charlie stood guard by the fire and the kittens snuggled together in a nest of old sweaters and fleece, Helen scrolled through Caleb's video again. The final frame showed her cradling the kitten, eyes closed, Charlie's tail mid-wag behind her. Hope had a face now, and it was theirs. The sky over Willow Grove had turned amber by mid-afternoon, as if the maples themselves had melted upward into the heavens. Their flaming leaves danced in the breeze, showering the sidewalks in gold. It was the kind of day that normally made Helen Whitaker reach for a blanket, a book, and a cup of tea. But this afternoon, there would be no quiet. At exactly 3:10 p.m., a pair of police cruisers turned off Main Street and rumbled up the long, weed-choked drive toward the Blackwell estate. Helen stood beside Maribel at the edge of her porch, watching the dust rise behind the tires. Charlie sat by her feet, tail sweeping once, then still. Maribel wore a clean gray coat and carried a folder under one arm. Her hands shook slightly, but her jaw was set. She hadn't said much that morning, just nodded when Helen passed her a mug of chamomile and whispered, "Today's the day." The officers exited their vehicles in synchronized steps, their navy uniforms sharp against the faded backdrop of the Blackwell mansion. Leading them was Detective Lyle Morgan, a tall man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered with a thick mustache and dark eyes that didn't blink much. He had the quiet intensity of someone who'd spent years sifting truth from silence. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows and a notepad was already in his left hand. Lyle had grown up in Bennington, a few towns over, and returned to Vermont after a decade with the Boston PD. He was known for being fair, methodical, and remarkably unshakable except around cats, which he was mildly allergic to. "We've got enough for probable cause," he said to Helen as he approached the porch. "Caleb's footage, your statement, the veterinarian's report. Maribel's testimony seals it." Helen nodded. Maribel clutched the folder tighter. "He'll deny everything," she murmured. "Doesn't matter," Lyle said gently. "We've got enough, and the media's already watching." Maribel blinked, as if realizing for the first time that her story would no longer remain in the dark. As the officers moved toward the mansion, Helen felt a quiet tide of something deeper than satisfaction. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vengeance. It was simply relief, like breathing for the first time after being underwater far too long. Everett didn't fight the arrest. He opened the door without expression, stood in silence while they read his rights, and calmly folded his hands behind his back. His silver hair gleamed in the autumn sun, and his eyes, gray, unreadable, never left Helen's face. Maribel looked away. By sunset, Everett Blackwell was in custody. Later that week, the kittens were transferred one by one into the care of the Briar Hollow Rescue Center. a shelter nestled 20 minutes outside Willow Grove, run by a retired nurse named Sarah Doyle. Sarah was tall, lean in her 60s, with wild silver curls and a no-nonsense demeanor softened by a voice like honey steeped in peppermint. She had taken in animals for over 3 decades and spoke to each one like they were old friends returning from war. "You've done good work, Helen," she said, placing a hand on Helen's shoulder as they loaded the final crate into her van. "Now let us help them thrive." But not all the kittens left. Helen kept 2. One was Ember, the fragile ginger kitten with the limp hind leg, now stronger, braver, and inexplicably drawn to warmth. The other was a runt Maribel had named Clover, whose white paws and curious green eyes had made Charlie melt the first time she'd curled against his chest. "They're staying," Helen told the officer who filled out the release form. "They've already chosen this home." Caleb came by often, almost daily now. He always brought something: drawings, snacks for the cats, new ideas for shelters built from cardboard and old flannel. Helen kept a growing stack of his sketches in a shoebox labeled "Things That Matter." One Saturday afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching Charlie nap beside Ember and Clover, Caleb said, "My dad wants to meet you." Helen looked up surprised. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. He saw the video, the one that went viral, and the news story about Everett. I think it made him think about things. Tom Bennett arrived that evening just after dinner. He was in his late 30s, tall and broad with calloused hands and a face carved by years of working long shifts and forgetting how to talk about feelings. He wore a blue flannel jacket and held a small bag of cat treats like it might explode. "Helen," he said simply. "I'm Tom. I wanted to thank you." For what, she asked. He glanced at Caleb, who was pretending not to eavesdrop from the porch rail. "For helping my boy believe in things again. He used to draw in the garage, alone, quiet. Now he runs through the house talking about kittens and justice and that golden dog of yours like they're superheroes." Helen smiled. "Maybe they are." Tom nodded slowly. "Maybe they are." They shook hands, and that was enough. Maribel stayed with Helen for several weeks after Everett's arrest. She moved quietly, helped with the cats, fixed breakfast each morning. Slowly, her smile returned. Her case drew attention from several advocacy groups. A local nonprofit offered her legal representation. Another helped her find work at the Briar Hollow shelter, where Sarah had instantly welcomed her into the fold. "I think I've found my place," Maribel said one morning as she packed her bag. "Among creatures who don't ask me to be perfect, just kind." Helen hugged her tightly. "You always were." One evening near the end of October, as leaves danced along the sidewalks and the town prepared for its quiet Halloween, Caleb showed Helen a new drawing. It was of Charlie lying beneath a maple tree surrounded by kittens. Above him floated wings sketched in pale yellow, and a soft glow around his head like a saint from stained glass. "You drew him as an angel," Helen whispered. Caleb nodded. "Because he saved everyone." Helen didn't reply at first. She just reached out, brushed Charlie's fur, and felt the slow, steady rhythm of his breath beneath her hand. "He saved us too," she said. Autumn had ripened fully in Willow Grove. The trees blazed crimson and gold, their leaves cascading like blessings onto the winding village streets. The air carried the comforting weight of wood smoke, cinnamon, and nostalgia, familiar and bittersweet, like a song from youth sung once more in old age. Helen Whitaker stood before the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the collar of a soft navy dress that still bore the faint scent of cedar from years spent in the back of her wardrobe. It had once belonged to her sister, passed down in quiet love, and today it felt just right. On the dresser, Ember purred contentedly beside a sprig of dried lavender. Across the room, Charlie sat near the door tail, thumping gently, his eyes wise and steady. Today was the 50-year Greenwood class reunion, and Helen was going. She hadn't planned to attend, not at first. But things had changed. Courage, like kindness, often grows slowly. Sometimes it arrives on 4 legs, muddy and panting, nudging you toward places you've avoided for far too long. The gathering was held in the old gymnasium of Greenwood Academy. Balloons in silver and blue hung from the basketball hoops, and folding tables were draped in linens. A photo slideshow played on loop against the far wall. Teenage smiles faded with time names written in curly cursive below each image. Helen entered quietly, Charlie at her heel. Conversations hummed. Laughter echoed in corners. But everything stopped when Doris Harland turned. Doris was still tall, though her posture had softened with time. Her auburn curls were streaked with gray, pulled back in a loose twist. Her eyes, green sharp and aching with recognition, met Helen's. Neither woman spoke for a long moment. Then Doris stepped forward and wrapped Helen in an embrace that smelled like rosewater and memory. "I forgave you a long time ago," Doris whispered. "You just needed to forgive yourself." Helen pulled back, blinking through tears. "I thought I was the only one who carried it." Doris smiled gently. "We all carry something. I was a small, frightened thing back then. The kind of girl that claws when cornered. I was one of those kittens, Helen. I just didn't know how to ask for help." Charlie, sensing the quiet tenderness, nudged between them and sat, pressing his head into Doris's hip. "Oh my," she laughed, kneeling down. "And this is the famous Charlie. He's more than famous," said a voice behind them. It was Mayor Linda Shepherd, a petite woman in her 50s with tightly cropped gray curls and a laugh that always arrived before she did. She wore a deep maroon blazer and carried a small velvet box in her hands. "We've never had a hero quite like him," the mayor said, smiling broadly. "And today we're making it official." The crowd gathered as Linda stepped onto a small platform near the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, Willow Grove is known for its quiet charm, its history, and its heart. But this fall, our town witnessed something extraordinary, not from a politician, not from a sheriff, but from a four-legged guardian who reminded us that courage doesn't always come with a siren." She opened the box and lifted out a small engraved metal town hero. "Charlie Whitaker." Helen placed a hand over her heart as Charlie was called forward. A silk ribbon was gently looped around his neck and applause erupted. He blinked, tail wagging slowly as if humbly confused by the attention. A local news photographer snapped pictures. Someone offered him a biscuit. But Charlie looked only at Helen. Later that week, the Willow Grove Library hosted an event that had started as a quiet suggestion and bloomed into something beautiful. The World Through Young Eyes, a sketch exhibition by Caleb Bennett. The reading room had been transformed with string lights and small easels. Tables held sketchbooks, prints, and a donation jar labeled, "For the Strays Still Waiting." At the center of the exhibit stood Caleb in a clean plaid shirt and combed hair, looking both nervous and proud. He greeted each guest politely, sometimes hiding behind his sketchpad. Tom Bennett stood nearby, watching his son with a gentle pride that hadn't always been there. His expression was softer now, his shoulders looser. Every so often he glanced at Helen and offered a grateful nod. The centerpiece of the exhibit stood framed on an easel draped in velvet. It was a drawing of Charlie curled protectively around a fragile kitten. Wings extended softly from his shoulders, not flamboyant, just subtle, luminous outlines. A single word was written below in Caleb's neat block print Hope. It wasn't just the name of the kitten anymore. It had become something else entirely. Helen stood silently in front of it, Charlie at her side, Ember curled around his paw. Clover batting softly at a leaf that had blown in through the open door. The library smelled like pencil shavings and old stories, and for the first time in years, Helen felt whole. Sometimes miracles don't come in the form of thunder or bright lights from the sky. Sometimes they come with muddy paws, soft purrs, and the quiet courage of someone who simply refuses to look away. Charlie didn't wear a cape. He didn't need to. His heart was enough. And through him, we're reminded that even in a broken world, God still sends his messengers, often in the form of the most unexpected companions. Perhaps the true miracle isn't in what was saved, but in the love that was awakened in each of us. So today, take a moment. Look closer. There might be someone near you, human or animal, waiting to be seen, waiting to be loved. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope. Leave a comment to tell us how kindness has changed your life. And if you believe God still sends His angels, hit the like button, subscribe for more stories of grace, and comment Amen below to join us in prayer for all the voiceless hearts out there. May God bless you and your home with peace, with purpose, and with paws that never stop bringing love. Amen.